Hamid Karzai accuses U.S. Special Forces of complicity in torture and expels them from an Afghan province. Can the U.S.-Afghan relationship get any worse? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Kimberly Halkett. Anti-U.S. protests have been held in Wardak province, where Special Forces troops have been asked to leave within 2 weeks over accusations Afghans working with them have tortured and killed innocent people. Now, the dispute is further complicating talks between the U.S. and Karzai's government over the presence of American troops once NATO's mission comes to an end in 2014. U.S. officials have said no international troops were involved in misconduct. And Secretary of State John Kerry has said the NATO-led International Security Assistance Force will investigate. Al Jazeera's Sue Turton sent this report from Afghanistan.
A flag marks the place a mother says her son was shot by American soldiers. It's where he's now buried.
It was around 4 in the morning. They blew the doors in. My son was at home with my 2 daughters and my grandchildren. We were all taken outside. They shot my son in front of us.
President Karzai has long insisted on Afghans overseeing NATO night raids, but US Special Forces are reportedly behind these attacks and their operations are shrouded in secrecy. The allegations are sinister, with claims that men are dragged from their homes and shot dead. No arrest is made, no evidence brought against them. This is Khar village, scene of another raid 2 months ago.
They killed 2 people, my brother and my cousin. I was here during the raid. It was 12:30 at night. They climbed over the walls. Both the men who were killed were asleep in the room. It was so brutal.
With these allegations mounting, President Karzai has taken a firm stand.
The Afghan National Security meeting made a decision and has assigned the Ministry of Defense to pull out all U.S. Special Forces from Wardak province within 2 weeks.
But NATO says no evidence has emerged so far to back up these allegations.
We take all allegations of misconduct seriously and go to great lengths to determine the facts surrounding them. Over the past few weeks, there have been various allegations of Special Forces conducting themselves in an unprofessional manner in Maiden Wardak. So far, we could not find evidence that would support these allegations.
A spokesman for the American forces here in Afghanistan could not confirm if all operations by the US Special Forces in Wardak province would cease within the next 2 weeks. But he did say that an investigation involving both foreign and American officials had been launched to look into these allegations of abuse and killings, and into the claims by one village that 9 men were taken late in the night 6 months ago and who haven't been seen or heard of since.
The villagers were celebrating a wedding, an Eid, when 3 helicopters landed carrying American soldiers.
They took 9 people from our village. They broke down the doors at 3 in the morning. There were so many of them. One of the men was a bus driver, the others drivers and school teachers.
These stories of abuse and killings play into the Taliban's hands, so President Karzai has to be seen to clamp down. But Wardak is close to Kabul. A bombing in the capital a month ago was traced back to the province. The president knows he must keep a tight hold on security there, but not at the expense of human rights. Sue Turton, Al Jazeera, Kabul.
Well, for more on this story, we are joined here in our studio by Kurt Volker, former U.S. ambassador to NATO. Masood Aziz is a former diplomat who served as a senior advisor at the Afghan embassy in Washington. And Gareth Porter is an investigative journalist and historian who writes extensively about U.S. national security and foreign policy. Kurt Volker, I want to start with you. These are certainly troubling accusations. The reining in now of U.S. forces in Wardak province. What impact do you think this is going to have on security?
I have several worries about this, and it's a very troubling story. First off is that these are accusations, these are Afghans who committed these abuses, but who are working with U.S. forces there. So if so, we should have known about that. We should have acted to prevent that before anything ever happened. We need to be on top of that sort of thing. It's also not the first time that we've seen these kinds of accusations of the night raids and the attacks by U.S. forces that have the result of alienating the population that we are there to support. That's something that people worked very hard to get away from the very early days of involvement in Afghanistan. It's always been a problem. If it's still a problem now, we've got to get on top of that. The final thing I worry about, and this was not really covered in your opening report, but if you have a withdrawal of the U.S. forces in the international community before Afghan security forces are ready, this situation is going to get worse, not better, both in terms of the Afghan security forces, possible abuses, and the abuses committed by the Taliban, where at least the international community tries to act according to some standards, where the Taliban is really aimed to try to intimidate the population and extend its influence in the country.
Well, Gareth Porter, maybe I can ask you, I mean, given some of these concerns, I mean, there certainly are questions, at least within the United States, about the strategic calculations of making such a pronouncement.
Well, I would just point out, first of all, that if we're talking about the problem of alienating the Afghan population through night raids, this is a problem that goes back quite a few years. And this is not something that's going to be solved by some reform in the system. The problem is that you have a system of special forces operations in Afghanistan that is, in its essence, problematic. You have lack of accountability, essentially, to anyone outside the special forces structure, where there's a system of incentives for the special forces to maximize the number of operations and the number of people that they either capture or kill in those operations. They get credit for that. They put out numbers and their budget goes up. And I'm sorry to say that this is a sort of systemic problem which has gotten worse and worse because of that nature of the problem. And so, you know, waiting a little bit longer for the special forces to do things slightly differently, or for the Afghan special forces to somehow be reformed after all this time, I think it's way too late.
Well, as you point out, this is an ongoing concern. In fact, Hamid Karzai has been making pronouncements and addressing these concerns independently for a number of months. In fact, he's been on a bit of a roll. The Afghan president has frequently complained that the U.S. military was undermining his country's independence, especially over the past year. For instance, last November, Hamid Karzai accused the U.S. of violating an agreement to hand over all Afghan detainees. The U.S. says it has concerns that prisoners will be tortured in Afghan hands, and in January suspended the transfer of prisoners to some Afghan jails. Now, Karzai's also accused U.S. forces of detaining prisoners who should have been released under Afghan court orders. He's repeatedly asked the U.S. to stop night raids and airstrikes in civilian areas, but NATO has continued with both. And earlier this month, he barred Afghan forces from seeking NATO airstrikes while conducting operations in residential areas. Mr. Aziz, maybe I could ask you that, I mean, given that Hamid Karzai has been on a roll in sort of attacking the professionalism and the ability of the U.S. forces, why do you think that he's continuing to make these sort of pronouncements? I mean, why now? To what end? Is it the domestic payoff that he's most concerned about?
Right. I think that we need to look at this in a bit more context. A lot of the demands that President Karzai had put on the table, including this recent one about special forces, are not really new. Like you had pointed out, there have been a number of other requests in the past, including asking the Afghan army not to call for airstrikes by NATO. So this is an attempt in establishing a process, perhaps in conjunction with certain agreements with the United States and the U.S. forces, to reestablish or state the sovereignty issues of Afghanistan as NATO and U.S. troops are withdrawing, which is an important thing. But at the same time, all these are symptoms of much deeper issues that we have to deal with right now. The transition process that we're speaking about, the 2014 deadline of U.S. troops withdrawing, right, is looming over the horizon. And there are two fundamental issues that I'm very concerned about. One is that, you know, here's the U.S. withdrawal after 11, 12 years of involvement in Afghanistan. U.S. and NATO is pretty much on a rush for the exits right now. All the strategies behind it is really an exit strategy completely. There's really not much that really would be sustainable. The premise is that the Afghan army will stand by its own and secure not only the Afghanistan territory but the region itself. At the same time, we have elections coming in Afghanistan in 2014, and these elections are critically important. It's in 2014 as U.S. withdrawal is happening at the same time, and there's a question mark as to whether or not those elections, the outcomes are going to be effective or not. If they're going to be as bad as in 2009, which is what happened, it might even push the country into a more precarious position or a position of a civil war that might happen. So we have an Afghan army that is not going to be effective in establishing security. Right. We have a U.S. withdrawal that is happening, and we have this election. We're going to be in a much worse position than we are now. So some of these are symptoms of the more fundamental issues that need to be discussed.
Well, it seems though that there is in all of those points, there is the domestic concern that seems to be primary. I mean, is that what's happening here? I mean, Volker, is this going to be enough, these actions by Hamid Karzai, to temper the public resentment that obviously is the case?
I don't think so. This has been a pattern that we've seen over years, 6, 7, 8 years, of blaming the international community. President Karzai lashing out at the international community for some of these activities which do need to be corrected, rather than acknowledging in a public way that he also needs to be a fundamental partner with the international community to provide for security and transition and reform inside Afghanistan. And that has created these kind of conflicts with the international community over many, many years. So this is really nothing new there. He does do this, as Masood said, I agree, to try to shore up his image in terms of the way the Afghan public sees him. But the fact is, I think his image is shaped more by a general perception of corruption and ineffective governance in Afghanistan, where no one is really buying into the current leadership at the moment. That's something that's going to we have to hope that the presidential elections in 2014 will create some new legitimacy to governance in Afghanistan. Very dicey, and I have to say I'm very worried, as Masood is, if the security forces aren't there to provide for a good transition, it's going to be very, very dangerous for the people.
But we're forgetting the fundamental point, I think, of this story, which is that special forces, both American and Afghan, are a failed and extremely dubious asset if you want to stabilize the situation in Afghanistan. The fact is that all of the people that they have killed or captured over the last 7, 8 years have not added to the stability and security of Afghanistan one whit. On the contrary, it has been a destabilizing force, just as Karzai said yesterday or the day before. And let me go back to one of the pieces of information I think that is critical about this story, which is that you had a spokesman for the U.S. military admitting that of the 9 individuals who disappeared in Wardak, I believe it was 6 of them, he said, were on the list of either insurgents or what he called associated supporters of the insurgents, according to various forms of intelligence. That's almost a direct quote. Now, that's problematic, and I'll try to explain why in 30 seconds. The fact is that the special forces have abandoned traditional intelligence gathering. They do not vet information about individuals who they pick up. In many cases, they don't even know who they are. They're tracking cell phone numbers for the most part. I wrote an article,
But isn't there an assumption here right now that in this discussion that the U.S. forces are in some way complicit? And there has been an investigation, though, to the contrary, that there was, that in fact that they may have been responsible for training, but that there may be other actors involved.
They're the ones who targeted. That's my point. They targeted.
I think these points are critically important, and I would agree with most of these, no doubt. There's been 14,700 civilian deaths since 2007. And the prior 6 years, we don't know, but probably tens of thousands. Those are very important issues, I think they just pointed out. But I think that there are much deeper issues to be concerned about now.
Yeah, I agree.
And those are not just Afghanistan issues, but the entire region. Imagine Afghanistan in potentially a chaos position, and what will happen to Pakistan next door. There's the looming issues of Kashmir that's back on the news again with India and Pakistan. This is very important. In 2014, we're going to have elections. If the government is not legitimate in Afghanistan, if there's no leadership that's going to be legitimate in there, if stability is not going to be addressed, even if the Afghan army is effective, which is not going to be the case, Who is the army going to respond to? What is the army protecting? Which government is it supporting?
Well,
so
that gets back to my initial question, though. I mean, the strategic calculations of Wardak province, I mean, that is the gateway into Kabul. Right. It seems to me that when you're looking for stability, when you're looking forward, you don't want your capital to be vulnerable. Kurt Volker.
Right, absolutely. So, one, it's not the case that Afghanistan is a generally peaceful country where the U.S. introduces violence. There's a war going on where the Taliban is trying to retake control of as much of the country as they can, especially the east and the south, but getting to Kabul, getting to what you're talking about. The second thing is that the deadlines imposed for 2014, I think, have had a destructive effect on everything we're trying to do in Afghanistan.
Well, and the president just as recently as the State of the Union announced that, you know, the troop numbers would be cut in half.
Our war in Afghanistan will
be
over by the end of 2014. Our war in Afghanistan, but the war won't be over just because the U.S. isn't there. It'll be a struggle for the heart of Afghanistan among warring Afghan groups. Could be very destructive for governance, for human rights, for the economy, for security throughout the whole country. And the effects that Masood talked about of that kind of Afghanistan are really very dangerous for the entire region and for all of us. So I think that, just to be clear, the calculations that people make based on the deadline, the U.S. forces feel they have to hurry up. We have to make sure we do as much as we can while we have a combat capability. The Taliban says, well, we can back off a little bit because they're going to leave anyway. So in the areas where the U.S. is getting out, we'll let that be for now, but then we'll retake them later. And the local population has to calculate who's going to be in charge later on.
Just to add this just very quickly, and I agree again, the question to ask is whether or not now, where we are, and we know that stability is not going to be assured by 2014 in the way that we always wanted it to. The question is, did the 11 years of U.S. NATO involvement result in something? Is there fundamental failures now that we have to talk about now, as opposed to 2 or 3 years down the line now? That is very critical, and not to sort of pat ourselves in the back and say 2014 is the deadline. After that, everything is going to be rosy. In fact, they're not, and it would be a shame that we would come back to Afghanistan in a situation that's happened before, where we've turned around and forgotten the area. Then there was a rise of the Taliban, Al-Qaeda came in, and 9/11 pursued. And it's my opinion that we are putting ourselves in a situation now that we might possibly have a civil war, destability, an army that's not responsive to anybody and is not effective. At the same time, we're rushing to the exit.
Let me address this narrative of the United States forgetting about Afghanistan and letting it stew and have the Taliban emerge. This, of course, is something that Secretary Gates talked about, as you may recall, a few years ago. That was the narrative that he liked to play. The problem with that is that what really happened the previous time around, as the Soviets were leaving and as the question arose, is the United States going to go after the government that the Soviets were leaving behind and try to bring it down, or are they going to try to foster a settlement? Or are they going to support the Mujahideen against the government of Afghanistan that was being left behind by the Soviets? The answer is that the United States supported the Mujahideen. They did not try to have a peace settlement. That was one of the options. It was turned down. And I'm afraid we're really seeing that replayed again now. In the last few years, what the Obama administration should have been doing from the very beginning was saying, we're ready to negotiate. We're ready to set a timetable for withdrawal. We will give our notional timetable for withdrawal as a basis for negotiations. There was just no interest in it, or at least there was no interest in it.
But now this belligerent stance, is that?
No, they didn't do that. They never did that. They never came up with a negotiating proposal.
I agree with this, but it's true. It's a narrative that's important to talk about. But Afghans and Americans have been involved in this process, and people in the region for 11 years now.
And have been financially propping it up.
And the U.S. has been spending $100 billion a year for almost 11 years now. And to come back to the same point that the history have taught us, it would be a shame. And I'm afraid that in the fast withdrawal, in the rush to the exits, we're forgetting these issues, and we're setting ourselves up. There are fundamental weaknesses that we're not addressing.
Who is forgetting these issues?
I think it's not just the U.S., but the U.S. has been at the lead in this. So it's primarily the U.S. strategy. And in the midst of all this, we focus completely on a military strategy to resolve the threats in the region. We have not done anything, in my view, in the political and diplomatic realm of any significance to be commensurate with our involvement, military involvement. So we have failed in those manners. Now, we have 2 years here to still talk about. What I want to see, ideally,
because moving towards the status of forces agreement, this is where this is all headed right now.
One of the things that's very important is for the U.S. to do two things to reassure the region itself and Afghanistan, is to say that the U.S. will be standing behind the Afghan army post-2014 to assure that the elections are going to happen under a secure environment, one. Two, that the U.S. would have involvement in supporting Afghanistan from a security perspective, from training, from providing equipment on a long-term basis. If we don't do that, as the ambassador said before, we set up ourselves by having deadlines saying and broadcasting to everybody, including the Taliban, that we're leaving.
So that's what right. The U.S. needs to do. What does Hamid Karzai need to do? I mean, right now he's positioned himself in a belligerent stance. You know, his power and has been propped up by the United States all this time. As it moves forward to this deadline of 2014, right. What does Hamid Karzai need to do?
I'll tell you, I think the most important thing that President Karzai could do is focus on building the institutions that will last in Afghanistan beyond himself. So when he moves on from being president in 2014, Afghanistan needs to have a functioning government, a functioning legislature, a functioning judiciary, the ability of the center to work with the governors in the provinces. If he can focus on doing that and leaving something behind that works, his successor may have an opportunity to really build governance in Afghanistan. I don't think President Karzai will recover his own credibility in the next year, but he can do some good work to leave this behind.
Gareth Porter, I mean, is he moving in that direction? Or
I actually suspect that Karzai understands that his best bet is to position himself for a political settlement. He's much more likely to survive if there are negotiations going on than he is if there are not negotiations going on. Because if there aren't negotiations, his government is not going to be the most powerful political military force in that country.
So he's focused on the peace talks?
When you look at the entire range of forms of power.
Okay, so he's focused on his relationship with the Taliban at this point. Is that what you're telling me?
I think he's focused on the fact that, you know, he's not going to be saved by military force as every month that goes by with American troops withdrawing and leaving behind the most hated, let's face it, the most hated American troops are the Special Operations Forces. Even McChrystal himself, who was the man who protected them politically, admitted that all along. He never, you know, had any doubt that it was true, which leaves open the question of why this problem was allowed to go on the way it was. But I mean, I think Karzai understands that there has to be negotiations. He tried a couple of years ago to move in that direction. I think that he was unable to do so because the United States wasn't really behind him. And the Taliban were saying, you know, what's in it for us? Without a promise of U.S. withdrawal, we're not going to negotiate.
Well,
so
that's the point.
Yeah,
Masood Aziz, we just a few minutes left.
Yes, to chime on this, when it comes to Karzai, for Karzai to have any legacy, you would have to have at least build the institutions that could remain after him, but also to broker a deal with the Taliban. And Karzai has been seeking that for years prior to the fact that, prior for the U.S. actually to get involved. In fact, the U.S. and NATO did not get involved in brokering a deal with the Taliban until just recently, a year and a half ago. That is remaining. I question the fact that when you're saying that we're withdrawing, that you can broker a deal. Exactly. And that is the problem today.
That's exactly the 30 seconds.
So what the U.S. did over the past couple of years seek to negotiate with the Taliban. The problem is they combine that with the deadlines. If the Taliban know you're leaving, why is there anything to negotiate?
That is what you're negotiating on. It's getting United States troops out. That's
already given away.
Well, it's not given away if you start early enough. But I mean, obviously, if you wait too long, then your assets are
clearly the issue. Gentlemen, we're out of time. I appreciate you coming in to talk to us here on Inside Story Americas. And that is all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now. I want to remind you, don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook. That's where you're going to find more information about our program. And as always, we want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering. Send us your ideas directly to us here at Inside Story at aljazeera.net. Thanks for watching Inside Story Americas. Washington.